Hey guys, this video is the first of a two-video lesson on interspecific competition, the next in our unit on communities. And so in this lesson, we're going to think of interspecific competition as this interaction between two species in which both species are negatively impacted by the other species. And so just as an example here are two birds, the bald eagle and the osprey, which have overlapping niches. Essentially, they live in roughly the same places, they eat roughly the same foods, and so the competition between them can be quite intense. And so before we get into those specific examples, I do want to point out that competition between species is really a cornerstone in evolutionary ecology. The selection pressure of one species on the other and vice versa essentially influences not only the realized niche in the moment, but also this is acting as a very strong selective pressure, ultimately driving the formation of new species, as well as the maintenance of this intense or abundant species diversity. And so we can model interspecific competition. That is, we can model the effect of bald eagles on osprey and osprey on bald eagles by adding what's called a competition coefficient to the Lotka-Volterra model that we've been playing with for the last few lessons. And so we're going to add alpha, the per capita effect of species 2, osprey, on species 1, the bald eagle. And we can use beta to represent how much does the bald eagle affect the osprey. And again, both of these are per capita effects. So essentially, each individual additional bald eagle has a certain effect on the population of ospreys. Okay, so we can just add these coefficients like this. This is the population growth rate for species number 1, so for the bald eagles. And so a lot of these coefficients should seem pretty familiar to you, but we're adding alpha here. So the per capita effect of species 2, osprey, on species 1 times the number of osprey. So per capita effect times the number of osprey is ultimately going to influence how many individuals are added or taken from the population of bald eagles next year. And so essentially, the bigger the competitor's population, the fewer of species 1 or the bald eagles there's going to be next year in the next generation. So we can do the same exact thing in reverse. So the population growth rate for species 2, the osprey, and this right here is what is important. The competitive effect of the bald eagles on the osprey, the bigger the coefficient, right? Essentially, the bigger the per capita effect of species 1, the bald eagle, will ultimately result in fewer osprey in the next generation. Okay. And so these competition coefficients, the size of them can absolutely affect the outcome of the competition. Essentially, the more these fundamental niches overlap, the more intense the competition is going to be, because you can't just choose a different food source. You can't, kind of go to the other end of your range of the zone of tolerance. Instead, you have to compete for the same resources, and then inevitably the competition will become more intense. There are kind of 4 possible outcomes of competition based on this Lotka-Volterra equations. And so here we can see species 2. So species 2 can contain species 1, so they kind of have a fighting chance. Or species 2 can't contain species 1. Essentially, if bald eagles are present, osprey have no chance. They are going to lose every time. If other possibilities, right? So species 1 can contain species 2, right? They do have a fighting chance, or they don't have a fighting chance. And so together, right, based on alpha and beta, both of these competition coefficients, there are 4 possible outcomes. Species 1 always wins, species 2 always wins, either species can win, or neither species can contain each other, and therefore there is a stable coexistence. And so essentially, sometimes there's winners and losers, and sometimes they can actually coexist. And so one example that I want to bring up is squirrels. Of course, in South Jersey, we only really see gray squirrels, but elsewhere along the East Coast and elsewhere in the world, there are multiple species of squirrels. And as you might imagine, their niche overlaps considerably. And so when I first moved to New Hampshire as an undergrad, I was fascinated by these two species. So the gray squirrel, which we're used to, and the red squirrel, which is about half the size of the gray squirrel. And so when I first noticed that, like, hey, there's another species of squirrel, I was like, huh, those little guys are going to get beaten up. They don't stand a chance. But as I observed casually on the way to class in the morning or just sitting outside my dorm, I noticed that these little squirrels, the red squirrels, were just vicious, right? They were super aggressive. They were really fast. And I saw them looking like they were kind of winning this competition. So they were able to get a lot more acorns from what I could see than the gray squirrels did, which were, a little bit slower, a little bit clumsier, and definitely did not stand up to this tiny little bully. And so I really thought that, if there was going to be a hard winter, if these species were absolutely dependent upon whatever acorns, whatever other food that they had cached over the winter, that the red squirrels, which were smaller and looked like they were catching up or caching more food, I really thought that the red squirrels were going to win. But turns out that the gray squirrels are a lot smarter than the red squirrels. And so they might not have been able to stand up to their tiny little bullies, but they were actually more strategically caching food. Also, they have a little bit of a wider range of food sources or types of food that they can eat. And so ultimately the next year, both were still present. And the gray squirrels actually seem to be a little bit more abundant. And so I just bring this up because both of these animals have very overlapping fundamental niches, but they both have slightly different strategies for, essentially surviving in spite of this competition. All right, so these guys are little bullies, they're a little aggressive, but these guys are super smart. And a similar example in the 1800s, gray squirrels, right, which are our normal species here, our local species, these gray squirrels were imported into Europe, and they just spread like crazy. So very successful in Europe and ultimately into Asia. And this introduction of a new competitor has had some pretty profound effects on the Eurasian red squirrel. So these guys, the little tufted, cute little ears here. And so these Eurasian squirrels, in the absence of a competitor before, right, at least a competitor that had such an overlapping niche, they were, they had big stable populations, but as soon as this competitor was introduced, the population of these red squirrels declined rapidly. And as of a few years ago, it was only about 15,000 total in the world left over. And so the competition coefficient of gray squirrel on Eurasian red squirrel would be much greater than in reverse. Okay. And so as a result of this very profound impact here, again, this population declined quite considerably. And of course, limited resources definitely exacerbate these effects. So maybe if there is a bumper crop, so lots and lots of acorns, then there's kind of enough for both species to coexist. But if there's a reduced mast year, so mast, the fruits of the plant, so reduced mast year, that ultimately would promote even fiercer competition between these two species. And I just want to point out too that if there is any kind of change in carrying capacity, either because there are fewer food resources or there's deforestation or something, habitat loss, ultimately that increases the competition between the two species. Um, the just as competition has a profound effect on species when a new competitor is introduced, we can also see the effect of competition when one competitor is removed. And so this is one of the ways that we can actually figure out what alpha and beta actually are. And so competitive release, this is the expansion of a species when a competitor is no longer present. And so if a competitor is removed for any reason, we can actually see the competitor species remaining behind expand to a larger niche. And so this can happen when a species invades a habitat that's free of potential competitors. A species can be removed from a community. And that's the example that I want to show you here. So the fundamental niche of wolves and coyotes overlaps considerably. And historically, so we're talking like before 1700s, before such a large population in North America, the range of these species overlapped, right? So what we can see here is the gray wolf, this lighter green here and all up here is essentially the range of the gray wolf before European settlers. And so pretty much the entirety of North America. And the darker orange here, this was the range of the coyotes. And so, of course, this area here, the Great Plains, as well as into the Rocky Mountains, contained both of these species. So historically, the range overlapped quite a lot. In European settlers arrive, bison, elk, moose, all of these prey species declined for a lot of different reasons. And so wolves started to prey on the sheep and the cattle that were being raised by the European settlers. And so that did not go over so well, as you might imagine. Bounties were paid to kill wolves starting in the 1600s. And so really there is this kind of mass slaughter of wolves for a couple hundred years until the late 1800s, when the last wolf in the Northeast was killed, generally eradicated from the United States, again because the wolves were preying on livestock. Okay. Coyotes, on the other hand, were generally not seen as a threat, at least not nearly as much as the wolves, and so they were kind of left alone. And coyotes really benefit from human occupation, and so coyotes kind of again that they benefit from agricultural land and logging. Essentially, human disturbance is very much within their zone of tolerance, as opposed to wolves, who generally avoid human disturbance. And so both in the absence of their competitor species, the wolves, and with additional human disturbance, so more agriculture, more logging, the coyotes' range expanded from this darker orange here out into the rest of the country. And so now in South Jersey, we have coyotes, we do not have wolves anymore. Right, so we see that by removing the competitor species, the other species can expand its range. Fast forward a little bit to the Endangered Species Act in 1974. The gray wolf was listed as an endangered species, and so efforts were made, particularly in the Northwest, to bring the wolves back. And of course, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone. They are reintroduced to Grand Teton National Park, and again, lots of efforts to maintain this very important predator. And so turns out that when the wolves, essentially were reintroduced, which is what this right here is, this is due to management efforts, due to the Endangered Species Act. Coyotes in this area, right, so still part of the range, are 33% lower in Grand Teton National Park and 39% lower in Yellowstone National Park. So again, what we can see here is the effect of wolves on coyotes by both removing the wolves and by returning the wolves. So we can get a really good idea of what these competition coefficients are just because of this. Wasn't meant to be an experiment, but essentially this observation due to different management practices. Okay. Often, competition is not just occurring between two species. That's not just wolves and coyotes. It's usually a lot more complicated than that, as you might imagine. So diffuse competition is the total competitive effect of a number of interspecific competitors. So instead of just here is species 1, the red species, here is species 2, the black species, and here we can have this overlap in resources, overlap in niche along an environmental gradient. And so very rarely is competition just between two species. Instead, there are usually many species that have overlapping niches within one or along an environmental gradient. Oops, sorry. And so removing a single competitor, right? So removing this red species here is really not going to have any kind of profound impact on the other species because they're already subjected to competition with many other species. Okay. So I'm going to stop this video here. In the next video, you're going to learn about the competitive exclusion principle. Thanks for watching.